Chalk Talk is brought to you by Isolite, the emergency lighting experts. Stay educated, my friends.
If you're interested in learning about integrating lighting controls with emergency lighting, you're in the right spot. I'm Western Regional Sales Manager Greg Keel, along with Eastern Regional Sales Manager Matt Bird, and thank you for joining us for our first Chalk Talk of 2023. Today, our host is our Director of Product Development, Evan Ackman, and Evan is going to be talking about lighting controls with emergency lighting and integrating UL924 and our 1008 devices. These devices for us, we came out with these a couple of years ago, designed in-house. They're in stock and price competitive. So Evan's not really going to get into the weeds on that stuff, but feel free to reach out to Matt and I for more information on that. But Evan's a road warrior. He presented actually an AIA course to the IES in Pittsburgh last night, drove through the night, made it back to Philadelphia just for you all. Without further ado, I'll hand it off to Evan.
The things we do for Chalk Talks, right? Anyway, thank you all for being here, and I'm sorry that my voice is a little bit hoarse because I was presenting late last night, and I did actually drive through the night to get back to my house in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. So I'm a little bit tired and a little bit hoarse, but that doesn't mean we're not going to nail this Chalk Talk. As Greg said, our topic today is the integration of sort of emergency lighting with the architectural lighting system. And we actually did do this as a presentation, as a Chalk Talk, years and years ago. It might have been like our third or fourth Chalk Talk we actually did. And as you guys all know, we didn't videotape them back at that point. And so it just wasn't as good. We wanted to take an opportunity, update it with some new information, a little bit, sort of better diagrams that we've come up with over the years, and really just nail it so that you guys had a video that you could reference when you needed it. Now, as always, because this is a Chalk Talk, even though this looks a little bit different visually in our new style for 2023, we're going to still do this as sort of a three-section type discussion. We're going to start with code compliance. We'll talk about the letter of the law, and we'll go into a little bit of detail about what it means and what a good architecture actually accounts for. We'll move over to the ALCR, a reminder that ALCR means automatic load control relay. This is the device that really allows those traditional architectural fixtures to change their mode of operation to be emergency fixtures when that's required because there's an emergency. And we'll actually sort of jump in and very quickly go over how dimming works in these systems. It's going to be a little bit of a blitzkrieg because there's a lot of information and we're going to go fast through it here. But the good news is our last section is the announcement of a new AIA course, which actually takes this information and goes into significantly more depth and covers a little bit more ground on exactly how the integration of sort of the architectural world meets the life safety world. And so without further ado, I'd like to jump right into code. And as always, this won't be a surprise to anyone who's been on Chalk Talks before. NFPA 101 is our gospel, and as always, it says that the emergency lighting system shall be arranged to provide the required illumination automatically in the event of any interruption of normal lighting due to any of the following. And now the first thing is what we maybe traditionally think of as the emergency that we're trying to deal with, and that's the failure of a public utility or outside electrical power supply. That's the power went out. But the other two are actually equally as important. The opening of a circuit breaker or fuse, that sort of drives us to do some things a little bit differently, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And then the last one is the manual acts, including accidental opening of a switch or of a switch controlling normal lighting facilities. And that one's a little bit confusing, so we'll talk about that too. I guess the word that sort of summarizes how I think we need to think about emergency lighting is locality. And a lot of times you'll see systems implemented with like a phase loss sensor back at the main panel coming into a building, which drives like an override in some sort of panel board. That actually by itself is not code compliant because remember, we do have to tolerate local failures of the lighting. So like a local circuit breaker goes out, someone crowbars into the wall and interrupts the wiring. That's an emergency for the purposes of emergency lighting. And so we need to get into all of the localized areas and be local to them. Keep in mind, there are also some jurisdictions where integration of local fire alarms is required. Our ELCD 924 actually has an option to integrate that fire alarm. So keep that in mind. Locality is key. And that manual acts thing, I remember when I first read that, I said, does that really mean that you can't actually control any emergency light? Like you can't ever turn it off? Like the face value of that reading sort of sounds like if I have a room where I've got mixed architectural and emergency lights, if I walk out and turn off the switch, the emergency lights have to go on. And fortunately, NFPA has an appendix which gives a little bit of clarity here, which basically says that if you do have some alternate source of power here, which is a battery and an emergency light, or it's the inverter with the ALCR device, there's no single switch that should be able to interrupt both of those energy sources. So we're safe. Everything that we're talking about here works. I suspect when NFPA 101 gets ratified into the next edition, there'll be some clarification on that wording, because I'm a person who's been in this industry for like 22 years, and that's confusing to me as it's written. And that appendix does sort of resolve the conflict internally, but it shouldn't need to be there. So keep that in mind. And that really leads us to this very workable architecture. And longtime Chalk Talk viewers will have seen this before. You can see a couple different things are happening here, right? We are putting our ALCR sense line on the line that is controlling the local fixtures. Obviously, we have our inverter providing power to that ALCR, and then we've got our critical fixture. All of this stuff over here on the right side is going to be controlled as one unit, and then that critical fixture is going to be overridden when there's an emergency. We have a lot of Chalk Talks that go into this diagram in a lot more detail, so if you want to sort of spend some time on that, go hit the UL924 announcement video or some of the other ones that talk about inverter architectures. But the importance here is that this architecture works because it senses the local normal power source, the one that's actually controlling the lights overhead in the room in question where there is emergency lighting. And then obviously it has a connection to the emergency power source so that it can be powered at all times, even if utility power is out. It has that local control signal from the lighting control system, which means it can basically mimic the lighting control over to the emergency lights so that the person in that room doesn't know the difference between the architectural lights and the emergency lights. It all looks like one system until there's an emergency. And then, of course, it also has that fire alarm signal if that's something that's required, although frankly, it's not required in a lot of applications, but it is there should you need it to detect fire alarms locally. There's actually some other cute use cases for that fire alarm signal that we get into in that AIA course, which I'll talk about here in a few minutes. And the other thing here is that basically the step and repeat nature of this architecture means that for every zone where you've got mixed architectural and emergency lights, you put an ALCR and you get to check the box and say, we've done it, we did it here. And that also means that all these zones act independently. Remember, that covers our locality goal. We're tolerating failures that are local to the room that we're in, but it also means something else that's kind of interesting, which means we're sort of isolated from our emergency power source too. So in the event that we have one of those emergencies that's not just a straight power outage, we're going to be providing power to the critical fixtures from utility power that's passed through the inverter. So we're not actually dissipating the batteries in that architecture. We're keeping them on. So now all of a sudden you get effectively infinite runtime for those localized failures. Obviously, you're still going to be limited by that 90 minutes when you're talking about like a real utility failure where the batteries actually sort of kick in. But that leads us to, what about dimming? The year is 2023. Modern energy codes require that we use dimming in at least some portions of our building. That previous diagram was just drawn with a snap switch. The good news, everybody, is that the ALCRs allow for more than just switched lighting control. And when you're in ALCR land, you're sort of open to a lot of things. 0 to 10 volt, Dolly, ecosystem. All those low voltage dimming protocols are very easily sort of in scope. And there are actually ways where you could utilize phase control with the ALCR. If you've seen my detailed presentation on the sort of the difference between ALCRs and BCELTS devices, one of the things that we say is that if you're using phase control, you probably have to be in BCELTS land. But I want to talk about sort of a trade-off that you could potentially make to allow yourself to use the less expensive, less complicated ALCRs for phase control dimming. One quick note here. Recently, there's been some confusion about sort of smart power packs that utilize the power outage as their signal to go into emergency mode. There's some manufacturers of these power packs and a couple other people have parroted the literature saying that UL has issued technical guidance stating that they're not allowed. UL's own webpage where they list technical guidance doesn't have that technical guidance listed. So I'm not sure exactly where that's coming from. But the good news is that UL edition 11 is due this year. So there'll be clarification verbiage in there to describe exactly what that is. So pay attention to that. And I'll probably do a chalk talk once it comes out, just on the differences between edition 10 and edition 11, just so you guys are all aware. But we're going to jump in and blast through these dimming technologies. And the drawing here looks almost identical to the one that we started with here today. But now we have 0 to 10 volt control wires. You can see the 0 to 10 volt from this lighting control obviously goes to our non-critical fixtures. But the other thing that it's going to do when we want to integrate dimming here is we're going to take it and we're going to route it through our ALCR and out to the critical fixture. This works because the way that 0 to 10 works is kind of interesting. If the control signal were to go away, this fixture will ramp up to 100%. This makes a lot of sense if you sort of think about it critically for a few seconds. If you just don't connect the control wires, you basically just have a switched fixture. And so if you're dimming it through those 0 to 10 volt wires, and then when there's an emergency, I can open this little relay right here, disconnecting the control wires from that 0 to 10 volt fixture, which means that, yes, it's going to turn on because I've closed this relay, but it's also going to go to 100%, a nice known light level now, because I've disconnected the control signals, and now the critical fixture is operating in a way that's code compliant. We've gone to a known light level in an emergency. We've overriding the dimming signal here. Dolly and ecosystem is a little bit more interesting, but it has some of the same characteristics of 0 to 10 volt. Obviously, Dolly is a digital bus, and so it's sitting here and it has like a digital communication signal that it's sending to and from the fixtures. And the cool thing about the way that Dolly operates is it has that same sort of operational philosophy that 0 to 10 has. If there's no communication, this device goes to its emergency mode. And so that's by default 100%, but you can actually set it to different levels through commissioning. But we can do kind of the same thing here. We can let this thing go through that relay. The communication just passes through. If we observe the local fixtures on our sense line, then we can disconnect the Dolly bus. And by design or by standard, when these devices don't hear any communication signal for 200 milliseconds, they go to their emergency light level, and so everything works exactly as you'd expect, right? We'll provide critical power to our critical fixtures. We won't do it to the non-critical fixtures. Overriding and opening that Dolly bus, disconnecting it from the fixtures means that everything that has power will go to its emergency mode. And so it just, again, works exactly as you'd expect. It works effectively the same as that 0 to 10 volt situation we saw on the previous slide. Now, I mentioned that phase control is a little bit goofy, and there is a trade-off here. So if you're going to have a zone of phase control because customer VE'd out the 0 to 10 volt fixtures, because you're in a sort of a highly designed retail space where there's a little bit of power density allowed, so there's some halogen fixtures in there, but you want them to be on the emergency circuit. If you have a zone that's mixed between critical and non-critical, you can't do what you see on screen here. You're going to have to go look at our ALCR BCELTS overview because you're going to be in BCELTS land. But if you can make the trade and say that instead of having a mixed zone, we could turn all of those fixtures into critical fixtures, then we can actually utilize the ALCR, the UL924 style device, by just shunting around that phase control dimmer. So the way that this works is in normal operation, right? You still have a normally on power source coming from your inverter. This 2-wire dimmer is going to sit there and provide power. This ALCR is only looking at utility power in the area. It's not actually looking at any control signals. So this relay, let me clean up my drawing here. This relay right here is just going to sit off the entire time. But when there is an emergency, it's going to short out that 0 to 10 volt dimmer, which means that it's effectively out of circuit, and all of these critical fixtures will jump on to 100%, taking us to that known light level. So the trade-off here is, from a design perspective, yeah, everything is going to be critical. You might be overlighting the space, which is not a bad thing necessarily for an emergency, and you're going to need a little bit of extra battery capacity on the inverter to deal with the additional fixtures. That trade-off is often worth it because the cost to go from this ALCR over to that BCELTS can be fairly costly, right? There's a big cost difference. There's a big complexity difference, and that cost rises a lot faster than the cost of a little bit of additional battery capacity. So if you're in a situation where phase control comes up, either because it's been VE'd in or because it's there as a part of the design and it's involved in the emergency lighting, consider doing something like this because it could actually save you some money and headache as you go. Now, there's a lot of nuance to that phase control situation. There's a lot of nuance to how Dolly and ecosystem based systems will work when you start to get to multiple zones and you want sort of some hierarchical information going around back and forth. And it's way too much for this 15-minute chalk talk, which I'm already 1 minute over, and which I apologize for. But we do have a new AIA course, ISO 1010. It goes into great and exhausting detail on ALCRs, BCELTS devices, and how that integrates with all of the different control topologies, as well as sort of a focus on like minimizing the amount of equipment that's necessary, minimizing cost. It goes into a lot more trade-offs and a lot more depth in terms of how these systems have to come together. So if that's something that you want for either you, yourself, your agency, your customers, reach out to us. We can deliver it live in person. We can do it over Zoom. And it's also probably in the next week or so going to be available on the Continuing Architect for people to go look at free of charge, sort of streaming on demand. It's cheaper than Netflix, and we don't cancel things all the time. So you could check it out there if you just want to see what that looks like. As always, we appreciate you being here. We have a lot of this information available on the website already. We have a white paper on our ELCDs that goes into this in a lot of detail. The wiring diagrams are a part of the spec sheets and the instruction sheets. All that stuff is up there already. As a follow-up to this, we'll send out that white paper, but you're going to get a video link of me giving this presentation. This one was pretty good, so we might actually use session 3 this month. But we'll also send out the sales presentation slides. So if you don't want to listen to audio, if you want to give this presentation yourself to other people in your agency, to your customers, to your family to put them asleep, please use the slides. They're available on our website. They're there for you to take advantage of. And if you do have questions about this topic, I know this one's pretty dense. If you want to talk about anything else that we do, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'm Evan Ackman. Greg and Matt are on the line. They love hearing from you guys. We certainly appreciate everything that you guys do for us. You're out there fighting the good fight, and we appreciate you so much. So if there's anything that we can do to support you, please do not hesitate to reach out. Have a good day, a good week, a good rest of your month. Happy New Year. If there are questions, I'd be happy to stick around now. Otherwise, we'll talk to you next month.